Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jamie Machek with the Wisconsin Valley Library Service. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our second webinar in this customer service series. Today we're talking about dealing with hostile and potentially dangerous library users. I'm so glad to have all of you here today. And we have the fabulous Pat Wagner, who is coming to us live from Denver, Colorado. And she's going to be sharing a lot of great insight with us. So Pat, whenever you're ready, please begin.
Great, Jamie, thank you. And thank you folks for joining us today. A couple things I want to talk about. And first of all, want to say, are we really saying that you've got to worry all the time, particularly if you're in a smaller community, about people who might be dangerous? Because sometimes people are just rude. And I'd like to share some advice that my mom told me. I grew up in Chicago. I always think my accent is very obvious. And my mother volunteered for the Red Cross, and she drove an ambulance. My mother was like a race car driver. She was incredible. She taught me how to drive. And one of the first things she taught me is she said, assume the other driver on the road is drunk on meth, has not slept for 3 days, and has 2 crying babies in the back seat. In other words, you'd never trust the other driver, and you always have to be on the alert. I think the same thing is true whenever you're in a public service thing. 99% of the people out there are nice and wonderful. However, you still have to prepare for the eventuality that they'll forget to turn on their turn signal, or they'll blow out a tire, or something is going to happen. I want to tell you also a little bit about this program. And I was looking through my notes before I came on today. And the first time I taught this program as a CE program for libraries was in 2002, back in Buffalo, New York. And if you've ever been to the main public library, the old library in Buffalo, it is a big building in a pretty gritty city with a pretty gritty group of people who come in and out. A lot of different kinds of people come in and out. And they had brought me in to do a program on this topic. Part of the reason for this is I had taught conflict management as a retired class for the Denver Police Academy, not to teach them how to deal with criminals, but everyday situations that they might have with each other and the general public. And I taught this pretty much the same thing that we're going to be talking about today. And I was getting a lot of pushback from people in the audience who were the managers and supervisors and so on. And they were kind of like, I don't want to say that, that they were rude, but they were kind of argumentative. Oh, that won't work, and so on. Finally, the head of security was in the back with his men and women, and he stood up, and he was a big guy, and he had like the strips of bullets across the front, so it looked like one of those old-time Western, right, with the bandits coming in. And he walked to the front, and I was about 50 years old at the time, and he said, I just want to say that I agree with what this young lady is saying. And he said, you should know that if you followed her advice, that would take care of 95% of the concerns you have at the front desk. That's how much it would cut down what we're doing. And after that, people agreed with me. And through the years, if I am doing a similar workshop for local government, if there's police officers, security officers, sheriffs in the room, they are pretty much 100% saying, yeah, this is how to do it. So this whole idea is we need to plan as individuals and as a library as if someone might be dangerous, and preparation is 90% of it. Every program I do has these key ideas, and there's 2 things that, if you don't pay attention to anything else in the program today, are consistency and courtesy. That one of the main reasons that opportunistic people will take advantage is because they know they can play people against each other. We had 2 kiddies for many years, Joe and Lefty, who were brothers, and my husband and I work out of the house, and Lefty in particular, who was a chow hound, would come up to me and say, it's 3 o'clock and Leif, my husband, hasn't fed me yet. Could you please feed me? But I'd go and talk to Leif in his office and say, did you feed the boys? And he said, sure, 10 minutes ago. And all of you who are parents or have worked with animals know that will happen. Well, guess what? Patrons do the same thing. They develop favorites. And folks, I know it can be very flattering, but after a while, they know they can play people against each other and manipulate them. The second thing is courtesy, that we don't want you to choose between being nice or mean. You don't have to be nasty or mean or rude to influence another person's behavior. What you have to be is firm and rational, right? It's like you channel your inner adult. And at the same time, you need to trust your gut about what's going on and how it's going on. So let's see what we have today. We will be stopping halfway through for see if there's any questions, and Jamie and I will leave time at the end for questions as well. First of all, to ensure everyone on the staff knows what to do in emergencies. And please just don't tell me, oh yeah, everyone knows what to do. I was working with a rural library, and the county was about 1,800 people, 700 people in town, but it was in a tourist area with a lot of folks from out of state coming through, and they were having some problems with some library users. And I was there and I said to the director, well, could I see the sheet that you have that's like the emergency sheet that you put up to help people? She said, oh, sure, I'll get that for you. An hour and a half later, they found a copy buried in a file cabinet, and nobody on the staff had ever seen it or heard it. It was just in the brain of the director, who thought that she had passed it out to everyone and they had discussed it, and they never did. So I really need to have you go one at a time and make sure that people know, and hopefully this will be inspiration to get people out of being so dramatic about difficult encounters, right? If you watch people who are specialists, and right now in this day and age, we have a chance to watch and appreciate how good people are who actually deal with life and death matters, with doctors and nurses and police officers and emergency personnel. It's not like TV, folks. One of the first things they learn is to stay calm. If they stay calm, it helps everyone else stay calm. That whole idea of being consistent in how everyone treats each other. And I'm not saying robotic, but you have to decide as a group, not as individuals, how you're going to deal with people. For example, and this probably is just my personal mythology, I was born and raised on the south side of Chicago. Those of you who know me personally know that I have a good sense of humor, but I'm kind of a tough cookie. People don't mess with me. Consequently, I have extremely high tolerance for bad behavior. It doesn't bother me. Pat Wagner cannot be the person who decides for everybody else how people behave in the library. On the other hand, I have a friend, and I love her dearly. I'll say her name is Mary. That's not her Mary. Mary is what my mom would call a lotus blossom. She's a delicate flower. She should never be at the service desk of any store, any organization, certainly not a community public library in the United States. If someone blinked at her, she'd burst into tears. So Pat and Mary should not be the people who decide for everyone else. What are the standards for when you say yes or no to somebody? Some basic security features of your workplace. Make sure that there's no blind spots, that you don't practice the false economy about not having lights and mirrors up where you need to do, and to be able to partner with local professionals, with your local police department, your sheriff's department, whoever is the lawyer, whether you're a city, municipal or county library, an institutional library of some kind, an academe, school library, whatever, that you partner with professionals to come in and communicate with you so that you're all on the same page. So what are we going to do today? We're going to talk about how we influence other people, the way to set limits on what's acceptable, and I'm going to give you today a little model that actually I learned from people who are teaching folks how to deal with people who are mentally ill. Hope you find it useful. That whole thing of don't escalate. It's not a contest, all right? It's not a battle with winners or losers. So we have to learn how to do this, even if it means you back down, even if it means you just smile and say, thank you for coming in, and you hate that person's political opinions. But That's for another day, right? Ways you can de-escalate: distractions, alternatives, and disengagement, some solid advice. And I only talk about things that I have personally used myself and other people have used. So I've gotten good feedback that it works most of the time with most people in most situations. And then the whole thing of, when do we call the cops? When do we say, what's the line in the sand? And when you call the authorities, okay? So first of all, we're going to have assignments. And these are things that I hope that you bring back to your institution. That you have cheat sheets for procedures at every single service desk, not just at circulation and reference. Any desks that are around, any places, including the back room. Maybe it's even tacked to the wall in your staff break room or in tech services. Cheat sheets for procedures. If there's an emergency of some kind dealing with a person. The emergency phone tree of who you call in order. And if you can't get a hold of person A, person B. I know a lot of libraries, for example, say if the director is not in the building for some reason, second person, or the branch manager, second person to call is the head of the board or the trustee or the city manager. If you can't get that person, this is the person to call, so that people know who are the first 3 or 4 people on the list. That we have a staff meetings with the leadership, not just of the library, but outside the library, to talk about what can be done. Law enforcement speakers to come in. And I had the privilege a few years ago to facilitate a meeting with the Casper, Wyoming Public Library staff and someone from the local sheriff's department about some issues that were there having to do with sexual predators who were moving into rural areas. You might have had a similar experience, if most of you who are from Wisconsin, dealing with this, and giving people guidelines for what they could do and what they couldn't do, which was important. And also, what's so important is that most of what we're talking about ends up being enforced and executed by supervisors, and making sure that the supervisors have the training they need, and they know the importance of consistent responses. So this is assignment number 1 of what you can, even if you don't listen to anything else, that you can start here. Now, all the stuff we're talking about also applies to internal customers, which is a euphemism for staff, internal stakeholders, volunteers who might be there from the Friends group, people who are using the meeting rooms and everything. For your staff, I think it's important for a yearly program. Some of you do this as part of your staff day, but to be able to talk about issues like grievances and what's the chain of command if there's a problem of some kind, and how do we respond? So we have the employees' rights, which often, if you are a unionized workplace, will also have to do, but not limited to, what's in the union contract. But then on the other hand, there's also the management rights. What are the legal rights? And we don't guess. We don't make these up. We find out what our state law says, and we can quote the law. So don't have it anecdotally that someone had a friend who had a friend who had a friend who said this is the way to do it. Leave that to the experts. And to clarify issues about what's right or what's wrong. I think sometimes when people are really upset, it's because they haven't been given information. And what we want to do is also let them know, we're just not making this up. This is not capricious. This is what actually the law says. To be able to take all threats seriously. And when I say all threats, I have visited libraries where somebody hit someone else and no one reported it to the cops. Somebody threw heavy equipment at someone else and nobody reported it. In one place, there was some sort of feud going on with the motor pool for the bookmobile, excuse me, something going on. It was a sizable library in a large city, happened in Wisconsin centuries ago. And I was around when this happened, and one person got mad at another, so he took an industrial strength spring, the kind of thing you might find in a truck, and compacted it down and strapped it down, and then put it inside someone's toolbox as a booby trap. So when the man opened up his toolbox, here this incredibly heavy thing came out that could have killed him. And they didn't call the police. So we're going to take all threats seriously. We're going to take stalking threats seriously, and so on. And if you have trouble with this, talk to the cops, because if someone makes a physical threat against someone else, that's serious. And it's much like domestic violence in that sense. And to make sure no one is exempt from the rules. Your board of trustees is not exempt. Elected officials are not exempt. That everyone has to follow the same rules, because sometimes, again, people like me come in and we find out to our horror that somebody's been doing what I could consider bad behavior for a long time, and they're being protected because maybe they're old, and I'm old, I don't mind saying that. Maybe they're old, maybe they were once well beloved, and now that they're acting out in a way that's not appropriate. Maybe they're an elected appointed official. Maybe it's someone who has status in the community. No, internal customers, no one is exempt from the rules. So how do we influence the behavior of others? And one of the reasons I love this little photo, I think it's so fun, is because what we have to realize is that not all the time, but most of the time, how we treat other people is what we're going to get back, even with people who are pretty difficult. In my checkered past, I worked with gang kids in the Southern Bronx in New York City in the early 70s. These were not fun gang kids that ran around in cute clothes and did musicals like West Side Story. These were kids who often had been in juvenile lockup before for violent crimes and such. And what I discovered very quickly with the people I worked with, if we treated the kids with respect, we liked them and showed them that we were there for them, they were wonderful. They were wonderful. And since then, I've talked to a lot of people who deal with prisoners, and they said, yeah, you run into the occasional, person who's too damaged to help, but most people are good people. So how do we influence people? Here's one of my favorite things, and you can comment if you want, if you're watching this live. When I have a bunch of people, I say, how many of you have that look on your face that stops a misbehaving 5-year-old in their tracks? And I'll swear 3/4 of the hands in the room go up. It's like, okay, bucko, I know what you're going to do. What they don't realize, if you're one of those folks, is that you have just put this chip on the shoulder of that other person. And particularly those of us who work with young people, high school age, even college age people and younger, they are very sensitive to both verbal and nonverbal clues, just like everyone else, a little more sensitive because they don't have the context that many people do as adults. They don't have experience. And so that frowny face of, oh my goodness, it's 4 teenage boys and they're dressed inappropriately and they're coming into the library, and you start frowning, you don't know how that impacts them. On the other hand, if you treat them just like everyone else, oh, wonderful, customers who may be able to vote or donate money in the future, right? That changes how they feel coming in, that they're welcome, and we haven't put them into battle alert immediately. So those things are things like the look on your face, the tone of your voice, the first words that you say to someone when they come to your library. Those all have a tremendous impact. But it's not just the people, it's the physical environment. So I'm a big fan of what they call the community policing strategies, keeping the area around the library clean and neat and swept up. No trash, you wash the windows. Even in very well-run libraries I visit, sometimes there's a lot of clutter. A lot of clutter on bulletin boards, a lot of clutter on front desks. Some people say it's very homey. I say yes, but to a stranger it looks like you don't care. Also, and I know this is very controversial, but what the staff wears can make a difference. There's been too many studies to show that how we dress professionally in a workplace makes a difference. So I am not adverse to people having the same t-shirt, for example. And I'm not saying we have to dress fancy, but for there to be certain standards about, whether the shirts are untucked, for example. And some people say, oh, Pat, that's not necessary. But yes, it is. And how we treat others, of course. And what about the signs they read? Are the first things when they walk into the library they see "Thou shalt nots"? I worked with this wonderful award-winning high school library in suburban Chicago. And this was a number of years ago. And I walked into this beautiful library, and there was a big sign up that say, "Welcome, we're so happy to hear and see you. This is a place where you can read, you can study, you can learn magical things, you can watch videos." And they had this whole things of not thou shalt nots, but thou shouts. And I asked the staff about disciplinary matters. They said, "You know what, when we put the signs up, we have less problems than we used to because the kids feel welcome and they don't feel like there's something they have to fight against." And I am proud of the fact that when I've had employees, people compliment me on them, and they said, "Oh, Pat, you're such a wonderful trainer. I just had this interaction with someone on your staff. Wow." And I said, "No, you don't get it. I hire for emotional intelligence. I hire for people who are emotionally mature. And the two things I look for when I'm hiring someone is emotional maturity and that they love to learn. If they're emotionally mature and love to learn, that's all I need, because we can teach them anything they need to know. I'm not running the emergency room of a children's hospital, so I can teach them these things. So I look for people who are friendly, who willing to learn, automatically have manners, right? Do they say please and thank you and hello, goodbye? Understand personal boundaries, meaning they're not intrusive, either physically or ask intrusive questions. They don't immediately blame and complain. If, in fact, if they make a mistake, they're the ones who come up and said, "Oh, my bad, messed this up, what should I do?" They take responsibility. That's what I'm looking for. And so for me, a frontline person, the ideal personality is that of a slightly sassy diner waitress, someone who is good-humored, likes life, likes people, likes teenage boys, feels comfortable, and they have a real life. They like kids, even when kids aren't behaving perfectly. They have old friends and they have new friends. I'm proud of the fact that my best friend from nursery school, Nancy, who lives in Illinois, we've been friends. We lost track of each other for a while, but we've been friends since we were 4 years old. On the other hand, I'm going out and making new friends all the time, and that they have a sense of humor about themselves. I'm not a therapist myself, but a number of psychologists and psychiatrists I've interviewed say that one of the things they look for in healthy development is people who can laugh at themselves, who don't take themselves too seriously, who can make a joke about themselves, right? That's one of the things we look at for emotional maturity. We also have to understand this applies to everybody in the library. Sometimes I find in situations you have 2 or 3 people who are maybe a little older or more experienced than other people on the staff, and they step in to handle stuff that goes wrong, right? They're the ones who handle stuff that goes wrong. What that does, and this sounds kind of extreme, but it's almost like they unintentionally infantilize other people on the staff. And if I'm an opportunistic criminal looking to do bad behaviors of some kind, and I'm saying like really bad things, not just the person who's rude once in a while, but maybe they want to steal petty cash, they want to steal books, or they intend for harm, they're going to, first of all, look for people who seem weak. They're going to look for dark corners. They may even case the joint, and they're looking for the opportunity to do wrong. Well, one of the first defenses, if everybody who works for the library is able and willing to step forward and deal with situations. You can't have lotus blossoms and wounded doves like my friend Mary at the front line. And she can't count on someone like me to come in and rescue her all the time. That's not good. And it teaches people who work for you that they don't have to be responsible for their own behavior. And I don't care how old they are, what size they are, their gender, how they dress or whatever. Being able to say, I'm going to be able to draw that line at the front line is very important. Very important. And you have to reconsider, because I know you don't have maybe the biggest pool in the world for employees, that people who work at the front line have to understand that's part of the expectation, that we can't count on people to rescue them. I'm very much opposed to that. We also have to decide if we're creating an environment that unintentionally we're devolving our customer service so that we have two levels of service. When I go and visit libraries, I watch how different people are treated. Now, sometimes I'm called in because there have been, I don't know, kind of not the best feedback from people who come into the library, that some people have observed some behaviors with staff they don't like, or something's going on. And if the director and the staff can't resolve it, they might bring in a third party. And again, I don't go through extensive interviews with people, but sometimes I just sit myself in the front. I don't do secret shopper stuff necessarily. Everyone knows who I am. And I sit and I read a book in the lobby area, or, you know, if there's an extra chair at reference or the circ desk, I might put myself up to the slide. And in most cases, not every place, I notice something, that there seems to be in too many libraries of all types, two levels of service, one for people we know and like, right? And the people who look like us, who are similar to us in age, socioeconomic status are two big ones in the United States, and for people who are nice. We're nicer to people who are nice. We even think that that's the way we should do things. On the other hand, we have a different level of service for people we don't know and we don't like. Maybe people who are really different from us in some way. Maybe people who are unpleasant with us. And boy, I fight so much with people who say they have to earn my trust and respect, and if they don't treat me well, I don't have to treat them well. Talk to a police officer about that and ask how far that gets them. If they say, well, if the citizen or whoever is rude to me, I get to be rude back. No, that's not how it works. People are looking up to you to decide how they're going to behave. So I should be able to come into your library and watch how people behave at frontline desks like circulation and reference, and watch how they behave with other people and not be able to tell who they like and who they don't like. There's also that issue of supervisors. I sometimes work with large district libraries, you know, the kinds that are often in suburban America or in large counties where you might have, 35 branches, 40 branches or more. It's very difficult if the supervisors, branch managers at each of those buildings are on a different page, or if the evening supervisor or weekend supervisor has different ways of treating people than people during the week. And if you don't have people overseeing folks, I consider that a false economy, even if you have to assign someone, because part of what you do when you kind of have that supervisor, however you call them, they kind of keep people on track, and they make sure that people are focused on the same goals, including sometimes a little course correction. I'm also absolutely opposed to only having one person at a small branch. And I see this in small libraries all over the place. It's getting less common, thank goodness. But I've had the experience of walking into states like Wisconsin with little libraries and people sort of saying, oh, it's not a big deal. We have this nice teenage girl who's at this little branch we have. It's a one-room, old style, rural library in a county where they don't have much money, and she takes care of things on Saturday afternoons. Not a big deal. Oh, well, just like put a target on her back. And by the way, one easy way we deal with this, if I can't convince the board to do otherwise, we ask the local VFW, veterans groups around the area, and we asked them if they would hold meetings and have the old coots and young coots come and hang out during the day, or if you have retired veterans or retired whatever. And, you know, just the fact that you have men and women who know how to take care of themselves, who are there being friendly, it's going to make that person who's there by themselves less of a target. And finally, this thing about people aren't alert to dicey behavior. And I had the experience, you know, I tell people I don't do secret shopper, but once in a while I'll come in before, the day before I'm at a training program, just to say hi and scope out the library, you know, see how it's laid out before I do the training program. And it was a snowy day in suburban Chicago, and I came into this beautiful library in a fairly prosperous neighborhood. And I think there must have been a sale on Land's End or something, because everyone was on their computers, just whatever. I am not a small woman, and I was wearing my big fake green acrylic fur coat. So trust me, people could spot me. When I walked by the circ desk coming in, I said good morning, or whenever it was, good evening. Nobody looked up. I got curious, so I started making noise. I started stomping my boots a little bit. No one looked up. I went up into the children's area where really you want to look for unaccompanied adults. Nobody looked up. I went into the art collection and took some big, fancy, expensive art books out of the art collection, the art book collection, made a big amount of noise, went into a bathroom, came out with the books tucked under my coat. Nobody noticed. I put the books back before someone noticed and got arrested. So I kind of made a nuisance of myself, and nobody looked up from their computers for 15 minutes. Okay, so then I got bored, sat down, read a book, went back to my motel, and I came back the next day. We talked about that. Nobody who had been on shift that evening remembered me or recognized me. We have to have people understand they need to stay alert. So here's something to take back to your library. If you were someone who was going to watch people working at a frontline desk with library users, if you watched the faces of the personnel, would you be able to determine their opinions about who they liked and who they didn't like coming into the library? If you listened to their voices, would you be able to determine who they liked and who they didn't like just from the sound of their voices? Anyway, let's pause here a minute, and I'm going to check in with Jamie. And Jamie, did we have any questions that came in? I can take one or two right now.
Sure. I also want to mention a comment that came in. This person said, we have developed a buddy system where if we need to interact with a possible situation, this aids us that we have backup as well as a witness to our actions if the behavior becomes a potential legal issue.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's great.
Well, I think a buddy thing is good as long as it isn't the, I'm going to rescue this person. But I think it really is good sometimes, and I like buddy systems to check on people and so on, as long as, again, person A isn't there to rescue person B.
Well, speaking of that, another question that came in is, we have a circ clerk who is very sweet, but I get tired of rescuing her from rude people. So how can I get her to be more firm with intimidating people?
I think you have to make it part of her job description. I know that sounds harsh, but to say, what I need at a front desk is a person who can do A, B, and C. We think you're very good with people and you have a lovely demeanor. If you decide that you don't want to learn how to be firm, we're going to have to see if we can find another job here for you. But the truth is, this is the skill set that I need here. You know, I know it sounds silly, but it's like almost as bad as having someone who's a shelver, Jamie, who doesn't know the alphabet and doesn't know the order of numbers. And you have to say, well, guess what? For being a shelver, we need someone who knows numerical order and they know the alphabet. And I know that if you go into most libraries in the United States, they're going to give you a test to see if you know the alphabet. And if you don't, sorry. So it's almost that extreme.
Let's go with one more quick question. How do you feel about name tags or staff, public library or any library staff wearing name tags? What's your take on that?
I'm a little hard of hearing. I missed the last word. What do you think about, if you could speak a little slower for me, please?
Name tags, staff wearing name tags.
Well, you know, I have two opinions on it. One, I think it's fine. Second, if you're paranoid, then develop a persona at work that's different from your name. But if you have a name tag, if you have a t-shirt and all that stuff, it makes you look more official. And the other thing is, it improves customer service because then they know if you're an employee or not. In a lot of places, the customers look just like the employees and someone's looking for help and they don't know who to ask. I go to a lot of libraries, Jamie, where people assume I'm a librarian and they'll come up to me and say, I'm looking for this and that. And I'd say, oh, sure, let's go find together. I know how to find the Chiltons in any public library in America, the hard copies. Let's go look for together. So, Jamie, I have impersonated a reference librarian. I don't know if that's a federal crime or not. Thank you. I'm going to keep going on this now. Okay, so what about this issue of setting limits on what is acceptable? And the reason I use these beautiful lilacs, very much like what's starting to bloom in our backyard here in Colorado, is that it's oftentimes we have to set limits with nice people. It's not just that we have to set limits with bad people, we have to set limits with good people as well. So going back to what I mentioned a few minutes ago, I absolutely believe this, and I ask people this when we talk. And let me add a couple of things. Consistent manipulative behavior. If there is a pattern, not just occasional, pattern of manipulative behavior by library customers, that's a sign that the rules are consistent. It's not the customers who are the problem, it's the library staff, because then they're playing that little game of who I can get something from. Not only that, it's not just the problem of the staff, but it's specifically about how supervisors, managers, and leadership set, with input from staff and with input from stakeholders, what the rules are and how they're enforced about things. So that when I'm asked to come in and deal with a touchy situation, that's probably the first question that I will ask. So what we need is a process for creating policies. That we do it transparently, meaning, as I said before, people have input and you have library stakeholders involved in the process. They may be even public meetings, you might have an advisory board. Say, for example, you have a culturally diverse community and you want to ensure that people are being treated fairly. It may be that the adults, for example, won't see how the teenagers are being treated unfairly, but the teenagers see that as well. Again, I'm a big fan, as you see, not just to bring in law enforcement, but social services, about the community and what you can expect and what's right and fair, what is not just legal, but ethical and moral as well. And to be able to talk to your community about this, to be able to use, depending on the size of your town or your community, again, local newspapers, social media, interviews on radio, to say, this is why we have the rules, and this is how we enforce them. And to have signs that are positive and common sense, which means no jargon. We need signs in our libraries that are for library customers, not for the people who work in the libraries, about where things are and so on. So there's no surprises or fewer surprises. When people start putting rules together, there's mistakes that are typical. One, too many rules, too many rules. Those of you who've been to my programs before might remember, this is one of my favorite stories. We were doing a leadership institute training in Iowa many years ago. We had 25 library directors from Iowa in the room. And I asked them what the people who came to the library would think that the mission and vision of the library is based on how they were treated. And one of the library directors raised her hand and said, based on how they're treated, I think that people who come to my library think that the mission of the library is to keep the books out of their hands at all costs, because we have so many rules. And later, I met her at another conference, and she said she went home after that institute and literally cut out 1/3 of the rules they had in the rule book. You don't need a zillion rules. And part of that is that sometimes what will happen is you'll get frontline staff who think their job is to enforce the rules. That's the number one job. The number one job is to ensure that the library customer, the library user, gets what they need to be able to go home and, you know, have a happy life, whatever it is that they're trying to do. We also find that people are often inconsistent in the rules. If someone is well dressed, for example, and there have been interesting studies and even TV shows about this, where they will take a young woman and dress her very attractively as a middle-class teenager in nice clothes and have her panhandling at a mall to try to get some money because she, I don't know, has to get gas for her car or something like that. People are nice and they smile to her. They take the same girl, dress her in goth clothing with fake tattoos and piercings, and she has the exact same script to follow, where she, where she has to ask exactly the same thing, and they call the cops. So we have to do a lot of seeking in our heart about, are we treating people consistently regardless of how old they are, their socioeconomic class, their ethnicity, all those different things. Most places I visit, when they start doing that kind of really look in their hearts, they realize that it isn't consistent. You also have the problem if some people enforce the rules and some people don't. Some people will ignore the rules, and by some people I mean library staff. Some people will enforce them and some people will enforce them too much. And then how do we know it's working? How do we have an interview program? Do we do exit interviews? Do we call people at home? Are we surveying in some way or another people who come to the library to be able to say, is it working for you? And are we also keeping track of incidents, if you want to call them, to say, yeah, it's not that we've banned teenage boys from the library. We have maybe even more kids coming in, but on the other hand, we have fewer, quote, incidents. So what we're doing seems to be working. Now, if I were to fly down into your library right at this moment, and hopefully it'll be a time when we're back at work in our workplaces, and I went up to every single employee and I said, okay, what are the rules here? Would they be able to tell me? We had a group of university professionals, and these were folks who were at a class on how to supervise teenagers, basically volunteers and pages and student workers at this state university. And we probably had maybe 60, 70 people in the room, most of whom, I polled them, had been there at least 15 years and were pretty experienced at their jobs. And I asked the question, what's the procedure for firing a student worker? Well, there was a lot of discussion, so I hushed everyone and I said, write down your answer and we'll go to the HR department and bring back the rule book and see what it says. Out of those extremely experienced people, and now thinking about it, there were about 50 people in the room. Very experienced people, 4 got it right. The other 46 had been breaking the rules of their own university for years. Even though they said, oh, I know this stuff, I know it, they didn't know it. So your assignment is to ensure that everybody knows the rules, and if they don't, that they have that copy right near them that they can pull out and review if necessary with the library user. Here's the part I think is so interesting, and this was something that I learned not just in teaching folks about conflict management, but in interviews with law enforcement about dealing with escalation in situations, and also with some of my mentors who are psychologists and psychiatrists. One thing I'm very interested in is the anthropology of conflict. And by anthropology, it means how human beings interact on a regular basis. What are our relationships with each other and decisions we make? And one of the big issues in anthropology is status. And what happens is oftentimes in those battles, this is my opinion, it's shared by a number of people, it's by no means the only theory of how people communicate. It's kind of like, I'm going to show you. I know more than you, and it becomes that competition. So somebody comes up, they have a chip on their shoulder, they start spouting things that you know aren't true. And it's not about your position of being personnel in the library. It's about human being. Well, I know more than that than you do. And so suddenly I'm in a battle. And it's the battle of, I have more credentials than you do. I know more than you do. Look what I used to do. How could you say that? And then we end up correcting customers. And that in itself becomes a battle, and other people will chime in, and suddenly tempers are up about what's going on. I have seen, and I have heard firsthand stories of library personnel demeaning the book choices someone has on a subject. A book the library has on the shelves and the person's checking it out, and the library person says, oh, that's a terrible book. Let me get you a better book because I know more than you. So what we have to understand that it's not just that we're trying to be helpful. It's also that status thing that I think plays in a lot of behavior. Attending a couple of programs that were national programs on literacy. One of the things that I'll never forget is a class on how to be a literacy volunteer. And the speaker said, beware of domination under the guise of service. And that changed my life, literally, because then you have to start thinking, what does it mean that I'm trying to be helpful right now? Or am I the person, oh my goodness, am I the person who's being argumentative? That's a difficult thing. Now, in this day and age where we're justifiably concerned about issues of, equity and diversity and inclusiveness, libraries have to decide where they draw the line in the sand. And I have to say, I'm Jewish. Wagner is a great stealth name for a Jew. And I have been in a number of rooms over the years with library people who look around the room and don't think there's anyone Jewish in the room or Muslim or different from them. And they say things and do things. And then I have to decide to pick my battles for the right time where I can do something. And usually it's in private. So I understand that issue of coming face to face with someone who I feel comfortable saying is an outright bigot, saying incredibly nasty and demeaning things about people like me or other people. I'm not African American, but boy, if I'm in a room with people and there's no African American person in the room and someone is saying stuff, you betcha I'm going to say something about it. But what do I do at a service desk? That goes back to how, as an organization, do we decide where we're going to draw the line in the sand to protect people, even if they're not in the room that day, or it's not obvious to any of us. And again, you don't have to take the burden on your own shoulders or even, quote, use your own judgment. You could start discussing what those guidelines are going to be. So here's a little handy list. When in doubt, simply provide the info the person is looking for and say, yes, it's a beautiful day. Yes, I'm really concerned about if football season is going to start up or baseball season. Yes, oh, have you seen that there's a sale on potatoes at the local Piggly Wiggly? Find a way to say yes, and even find a way for them to say yes. It sounds corny, but it's an old interrogation trick that helps to lower people's boundaries. Avoid political discussions like the plague, right? Just pretend when you walk into the library that it's showtime and you're that there to discuss politics. Simply smile, ignore what they're saying, change the subject, give them the book, and maybe ask them to, their opinion about something safe, like the Chicago Cubs or, I don't know, the Broncos. How about that? Now, it's important for us who do this kind of work to know what our own triggers are. When I first started studying human behavior, I went to a liberal arts college in Vermont that had at the time an extremely progressive way of teaching teachers. I was studying early education and child development. They did two things the first week of class. I was a freshman, 18 years old. The first thing is they actually put us in classrooms where we were there to observe and be student helpers. The second thing was they put us in group therapy. Isn't that interesting? Because what we were taught is when you're a teacher, your students are emotional captives of your psychological state, and that a lot of humans will basically try to work out their problems and issues almost like therapy with people they encounter. Well, guess what? The same thing can happen in a workplace. So one of the things they said was, we want you to learn more about what your triggers are. What are the things that make you angry, make you uncomfortable, so that you can watch for them as you deal with the kids. Well, in my work in conflict management, I have found this kind of training incredibly useful for me to understand what triggers me. Where do I lose my temper? And I have a very bad temper. I think I have kind of, how would you say, feral adrenal glands, you know? It's very easy for me to go into a flight or fight response. I have learned over centuries not to let what my glands are doing to dictate how I treat people, so I'm not the one who's putting the chip on the other person's shoulder. If by chance you don't know what your own triggers are, you ask your friends, ask your family and colleagues. I ran into this just a few weeks ago partly with what's been happening with the shutdown all over the country, and here in Denver right now we're on lockdown. And one of my neighbors, again, who I like very much, was talking to me about some people she didn't like. And I kept asking her, why didn't she like these particular neighbors? And it finally came down to that they dressed funny. And for some reason, the way she was raised, and she even said this, well, the way I was raised, you don't go in public like that. I say, we don't know what's going on for them, you know, because they go out that way. Well, I never leave the house without makeup. I never leave the house unless I'm fully drunk. I never go out of the house in pajamas. And I'm thinking, well, it's good she doesn't live at my end of the block, because when I'm home, I think my record for not getting out of my pajamas is 5 days. Very tasteful pajamas, but that's her trigger. And I have run into a couple of library directors who are like that they would judge people very harshly, particularly women, if they didn't feel that they were properly coiffed and accessorized. I know for some of you it might sound a little silly, but being a human being, some of us have what most of us would say irrational triggers. If you're working a public service desk, it's kind of good to know what might make you uncomfortable so you can take an extra breath at the time. So, distractions, alternatives, disengagement. One way to distract someone who is starting to get upset is to ask their advice about something. I had a man, because I've done retail sales, and I had a man at the desk who was really upset about something. I interrupt him politely and I say, excuse me, sir, I hate to be stereotypical, but you know, my husband's not that good at cars. My car's making a funny noise, and it kind of goes, go, go, go. What do you think? He immediately stopped his tirade, looked very surprised, and gave me a very useful discourse about, well, check this, this, and this, and maybe it'll be help. And I said, thank you very much. Anything else? And you know what? He forgot what he was yelling about and went back. One of the libraries I worked with in California, Alameda County, which is where Oakland, California is, they have toy baskets next to every service desk, the reference desk, circ desk, and they're filled with very cheap toys, little, you know, whatevers. So if a parent brings a kid and the kid is yelling or difficulty or whatever while they're talking to the person at the desk, they can give them this little cheap toy to distract them and play with. A great way is to have the person be able to sit down and write. Like, for example, someone's really angry at some new policy at the library. A good thing to do, it works pretty good, is to say, well, Miss Wagner, we take complaints seriously at the library. This is a form, usually half page. If you would be willing to fill this out, if you want a response, please put your name and a contact information. Otherwise, I will be giving this to my director or manager at the end of the shift. And we take complaints seriously. Just the act of the person walking over to a table with a piece of paper and a pen and writing things down is often enough to calm them down enough so that when you go to check on them, they're already gone. They've sort of come to their senses about things. Maybe, and this goes against consistency, but let's say you have somebody who comes into the library once or twice a week and they just borderline hate speech, they're angry or whatever. Maybe you find up enough about them so you can tell them, oh, by the way, did you know those new magazines that you like so much just came in? We have a new set of books that are there on the display shelf that I thought you would be interested in. So you sort of say, here's something, it's a distraction that I have learned enough about you to know that that's something you might be interested in. And you know what? Sometimes all they need is a glass of water. So you sit them down and say, let me get you a glass of water. It's one of those rituals human beings have with each other. You know, again, anthropology. that that's something you do for an equal. You don't bring your enemy a glass of water. You bring someone who's part of the family a glass of water, and that sometimes is something that they need. Sometimes we need alternatives. So what we want to do is for all of us to say, what are 4 or 5 or 6 things that I can do? What are the options that I can do for that person? So that in effect, you have all of these distractions and options and alternatives for them to be able to say, okay, my response as a member of the staff of this library will be more confident and competent if I know I have more than one trick. Now, informally being trained about conflict management in situations, that's something drummed into us over and over again. You always are looking for another great idea. It's just like being a cook. Any of us who really like to cook and take it a little bit seriously, we're always looking up new recipes. We're always asking people, just like Jamie at the beginning of this program before we started was asking people about what they cook at home. We're on some of the neighborhood boards that I'm on for, with the communication boards that I'm on online. Right now, we're swapping recipes all the time. And one of the things experience does for you is if what you try first, second, third, fourth, and fifth doesn't work, you have 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. That's one difference between someone who is a quote amateur and someone who maybe has a little more formal expertise, even though obviously amateurs can be terrific at all of that. So that's what you want to do for yourself and your staff, sort of build your toolbox of responses to people. So if the first thing doesn't work, you still feel competent and confident because you can try something else. So one of the ideas that I got a long time ago from a great children's book where people were arguing about something, the old grandma in the book said, substitute something more interesting than your anger. Find something more interesting than your boredom or your pain or your grief. And I think that's the same thing we need to do with people who sort of show up angry at our libraries. Is there something more interesting that we can offer them? By the same token, people who have their own full, rich, private lives seem to deal with conflict better than other people because they feel resourceful. When I'm in a situation, and I sometimes am in a situation with a really upset, angry person at the other end of the conversation, and it's not doing so well, one of the things that comforts me is I have a great marriage. I have a great little house. I have wonderful friends. I have work I love to do. I have a TV show that I love that's coming on tonight. Ooh, that'll be cool. I've been thinking about the book, and just even thinking about those little touchstones are enough to make me feel better. And you know what? I'm calmer and more relaxed, and that's a way that I can impact the other person's behavior as well. For me to be able to disengage with someone, can I say no thank you, right? And here's the formula. You thank the person, you set the limit, and you offer them an alternative. Thank you, Pat. No, Pat, you can't stand on chairs and scream at people. However, let me take you over to this particular area. There's some books here that I think you might enjoy. And then you walk away or you hang up on them, but mostly you stay calm. So one thing that you can do as homework is talk with coworkers about how to develop what we call the option frame of mind. What are more ways that are sensible and calm and effective that we can deal with people who are having problems? But then sometimes, Jamie, we have to call the cops. I know these are Mounties, okay? I know it's Wisconsin, all right, so don't yell at me. I do know. I have lived in Wisconsin. And this again is we want to be able to talk to our law enforcement officers about when they want us to call the cops. And we have to think about ourselves when we feel comfortable. And it has to be a frontline decision if managers aren't there, because we don't always have a buddy who's easily there. We have to take some sort of action as well. So here are some books that I think are terrific on the subject of dealing with hostile and sometimes dangerous people. I'll turn things back over to you, Jamie, and we'll see if we have any questions.